Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the next session in our Climate COP Pavilion here in South Africa. Here in Glasgow, the South Africa Pavilion. This morning is really just an informal session before we kick off the main theme of the day, which is just transition, starting a little bit later in the morning. But we wanted to have a discussion around some work that we've done working with the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition of the World Bank around carbon pricing and how we think about carbon pricing and its role in competitiveness. So it's really just a high-level session. We could end quite quickly. Happy to take people's thoughts and questions in the chat, and particularly for those of you that are online. Great. So jumping in. When we talk about carbon pricing, we tend to get three broad sets of questions. One is, how can we predict future prices? In South Africa, this is particularly thinking about price certainty post the first phase of the carbon tax, which ends in about 2022. And then what kind of pricing strategies can we use internally and also in the main system to understand future carbon prices and how will government think about these things? Then we get a big set of questions around complementary policy. You often read studies that say carbon pricing doesn't work unless it's implemented alongside other measures. And so how do we think about which measures are appropriate in which industries are kinds of another set of questions. And then the last set of questions, which perhaps is the most common in the business sector, is how does pricing impact competitiveness? And people are obviously very worried about being uncompetitive in a market. You add a carbon price on top of that, and you're even more uncompetitive in a market, particularly if carbon prices are implemented differently in different regimes. And obviously, this question becomes particularly relevant at the moment as we start to talk about the EU's border tariff adjustments that they're planning on implementing sort of also 2022, 2023. And then in the South African context and in developing country context in general, there's a big question around the impact of carbon pricing and the social consequences of the changes that it might trigger. And then we sort of trigger the just transition conversation. So the NBI, working with the CPLC, wanted to try to develop a methodology that we could start to have those conversations as a collective group. And so the results that we're feeding back here are from a very small pilot and a sort of experimental approach to how we can think about these issues. So looking forward to some of your feedback. So we did two kind of things in the process. One was we developed a process that we thought was useful, a useful way to run these kinds of conversations that enhances transparency and participation. And key to that, which we think was quite successful, was it kind of encouraged engagement on carbon pricing, which we don't often have, and it enabled that engagement in a very sort of independent way. It's one that's driven by facts and underlying critical data, which we found actually built trust between stakeholders as opposed to broke it down. And then it also allowed the extraction of technology options and the consideration of innovation over time, and get a sense from the expert stakeholders involved in the industry that could give us a sense of timing of innovation and when certain options might become available and at what type of prices they might become available. And then lastly, what we think the process will help do is to help policymakers start to think about pricing impacts again in an independent way that's driven by data rather than by ideology. And then finally, we tested this process. We ran it with two sectors. We ran with the steel sector and the cement sector, and we basically chose those sectors because of their carbon intensity, so in many cases trade vulnerability. So Part of that process was identifying the most vulnerable sectors, identifying what those sectors' views were on policy and on the finance measures that are available, understanding how they viewed the social factors and when they might happen, and what kind of mitigation options they were, and then also try to start understanding the pricing trajectory and how it might impact the sort of technology adoption rate and the kind of technology options. So to foster this conversation, we talked about three data points that we think are quite interesting to think about. One is the switching price. And I think the switching price was originally coined by the International Energy Agency, but this is the price at which you would switch to a new technology. So if you're making cement in the traditional way, at what carbon price would you switch to a different type of technology, a vertical kiln instead of a horizontal kiln, for example? The substitution price is the price at which the consumer would switch to a different product. Now, in the carbon tax conversation, this is interesting because in many ways, that's what a carbon tax is meant to do. It's meant to price externalities and change the pricing of products such that you choose a less impactful product. But understanding at what point that price happens is also an important part of the conversation. And then the last part was the sort of social costs and what do we think the impacts on employment are and all of the other issues that come with a just transition. So the basic process that we ran was relatively simple in process, but quite complicated in terms of trying to get data and access the data. But for example, understanding the competitiveness environment and substitution pricing is the first point. Understanding what global supply demand dynamics are, who needs it, who's buying it, at what prices, and then trying to work out what you're able to produce in response to that, whether you're competitive with other countries and other producers locally, requires a very detailed study. Very difficult sometimes in the actual conversation because of competition pricing. So you do need to rely on external sources for this part of the conversation, and something that can happen in research upfront and not necessarily in sessions with the sectors. And then where the sectors were particularly good was drilling down into the mitigation options, what technology is available, when will it come online, who's doing what research, what's cutting edge, what's not. And that then can be used to reverse engineer things like marginal abatement cost curves. But really, the key issue is to try to find what the switching prices would be. Determining the social cost was something we weren't able to do in this pilot. We just didn't have the time to do it, but it's certainly something that we have an ambition to do and something that we think is important to do. And what that information then gave you is the opportunity to have this sort of objective fact-based conversation around what's the complementary policy mix, what kinds of policies would work in different situations, and what would the policy goal have to be sector by sector. And we'll drill down into this in a little bit more detail just now. And then finally, you need to understand what the iteration needs to be. And so in all of the cases, we found that different sectors had different levels of maturity. And so some sectors have really great data, really understand what the technology options are, and some sectors don't. And so you need to be able to, at the end of this, assess what the gaps are, and then reverse engineer that back to say, okay, well, I'm going to run this process again and focus on these particular data gaps. This is sort of South African market and kind of split up by emissions, but also focusing on hard to abate sectors. So obviously the bulk of our emissions come from the electricity production sector in South Africa, given how coal intensive our power production is. But not a lot of that is actually hard to abate. Much of that is actually relatively easy to abate. If we implement renewable energy systems, and we can get that down to pretty low. The last sort of 12 megatons of that stack are quite hard to get rid of. Those are sort of the last mile emissions that you need green hydrogen or direct air capture or some kind of sort of not so proven technology to do. But and so we didn't really focus on the electricity sector. But if you look at the really hard to abate sectors within transport, there's quite a lot of hard to abate sectors sitting in aviation and shipping. Although road transport relatively easy to decarbonize, we have the technologies available now. But the ones we always talk about is iron and steel and cement. Both very difficult because they're largely process emission driven and they're very energy intensive processes, very difficult to decarbonize. And hence we focused on that. It is important to note, though, that these sectors are also very strategically important to the economy of South Africa, because as we work to resolve things like decarbonizing the power sector, we need a significant investment across a range of other things, including building transmission infrastructure and new wind towers. And so actually what we anticipate is an increase in demand for iron and steel and cement in our economy in order to enable transitioning to decarbonization in other sectors. And so the decarbonizing of these sectors becomes quite strategically important and central to our transition. So a couple of key lessons learned, and I've mentioned a few of them already in the process. One is we need that data granularity. We need to be able to get down to quite a high degree of understanding of the sector in order to be able to have this conversation properly. And so that's, getting access to market prices and market volumes and so on is quite challenging. But that's the level of data you need to get down to. And then, of course, on the technology side, you need to dig really deep. And maybe one example there is a key application of solving decarbonizing in the cement sector is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So this is where you attach other processes vertically, sort of vertical value chain orientation to cement or other processes. And that allows you to use the carbon output from the cement process in other projects that locks that carbon in and also then creates jobs and other values. But there's very few people looking at that in South Africa. We managed to find some really good data from some of our Danish colleagues. And so this is something that you then have to integrate into the process. And the process is key to reframing sector perspective. So what we found going into the process, the sectors were very resistant to a carbon price because they view it purely through the lens of their own personal competitiveness. Once you lift it up and start looking at what a global price forecasts, what does that mean for international markets and international demand, and whether you'll even be able to sell carbon intensive products into EU markets in particular, started to change people's perspective and flip them from carbon pricing as kind of the enemy to carbon pricing as one tool in many tools that you need to be able to transition the economy. So we found that output to actually be probably the most beneficial of our little pilot. And then the other insight that's really interesting is sectors respond differently to different prices. And I first actually heard this point from David Holmes from Shell, who made the point that in the EU at $50 a ton, you make quite a significant difference to power, but you make almost no difference to petrochemicals. And so if you pitch the price in the EU at that level, you're going to have different impacts. And the same is true for South Africa. The carbon price you need to transition the power sector, for example, is basically zero, because you can do it with existing technologies up to a point. And so, certainly down to sort of 17 or so megatons a year, you can do it through known technologies at almost no carbon price. But steel and cement, you need significantly higher prices and quite different to each other. And we'll get into that detail a little bit later. But that has big implications for policy that you attach to that price. So obviously, if you're trying to, if you're overpriced the sector, in other words, the sector would transition at that price. And what does that mean for the kinds of enabling policy that you would need? And of course, if you're underpricing, in the case of the petrochemicals example I just gave, then what other policy do you need in order to get that sector to decarbonize? And then, of course, sector knowledge is highly variable. This is the kind of point that I've made. Different sectors have different levels of maturity, for lack of a better word, in their particular market. And so we found that the steel sector, because in South Africa there's such a big involvement of international companies in the steel sector in South Africa, they tended to be quite a high level of knowledge, whereas in the cement sector, which is mostly dominated by South African specific companies, we found that knowledge of international trends to be slightly lower and therefore more difficult to work with. So just some interesting data. So we looked at a range of studies that are predicting carbon prices around the world, both for international markets and for South Africa. And what we find is the significant increase in carbon prices in order to be able to meet our net zero goals by 2050. And so you can see, for example, in 2030, carbon prices of $102 per ton on average across 5 sources, looking at at developed and advanced economies, $79 looking at across 9 sources, looking at global economies, and $56 a ton across studies looking at South Africa, only 4 sources. But the reality is that in order for us to meet these net zero targets that we're all setting here at COP, we need to be able to set much higher carbon prices, somewhere in the region of, say, $75 a ton in 2030, and then all the way up to sort of $200, $250 a ton in 2050. And certainly that's new to most people who are thinking about carbon pricing. South Africa's carbon price today is effectively $2 per ton. It's great that we have a price and the platform is set, but if we're going to be achieving the transitions we need, we're looking at significantly higher carbon prices. And again, that might be applied variably across different sectors. So I think I've made this point. There's a lot of studies and work looking on how sector differentiation of pricing is important in order to be able to transition sectors and not to be too imposing on particular sectors. So these were the kinds of outputs that we produced from the pilots. And so this is looking at the steel sector, which really doesn't have too many decarbonization options up until quite late in the process when you can switch to hydrogen. And to some degree, you have some options here. So you can, by using carbon pricing, you can shift this point earlier, and that would then lead to decarbonization in reality. And so lots of technical work sitting behind the slide, what the technology options are, how mature they are, when we think they might be ready. But basically, when discussing it with the sectors, because of the price of transition, which is effectively the differential price between what it costs to run the technology today in the absence of a carbon price and what it would cost to run the technology of the future, hydrogen-driven furnaces, then you would basically delay that decision for as long as possible, which is why you get this sort of sudden drop in the late 2040s. Similarly, kind of chart for cement, there are some efficiency measures that you can take and some sort of fuel switching that you can do relatively early on, and that gives you some savings, but generally you have a kind of slight growth in emissions up until you get just because you're using more cement in the market, as I mentioned earlier. And then you can make some big drops at relatively high costs out towards 2050. But there are known that we were able to find technologies applicable in South Africa that could get cement to net zero at the scales that we need it. And so then this in itself is a significant challenge. But something then that's quite useful from a policy perspective to start talking about carbon pricing. And so if you charge a particular price and there is no switching technology, right, then the sector really struggles to transition, and you make the product more expensive relative to the global market. You may not be pricing to the same levels and therefore less competitive. And really what that does then is if you're able to set these sectoral switching prices and these product level substitution prices, you can start to sort of plot them together at a point in time and see where you're going to have particular challenges. So for example, if you have, in the case of steel, the sudden sort of change in switching price as hydrogen becomes available, then if you charge a price sort of above this point, they are not able to switch because it's not a significant enough price. And so you've got to get prices up at this level in order to drive that switching. Which in this instance is higher than the substitution price. So if you pitch your price at this level, for example, you're not going to switch because it's not high enough, but you are going to cause substitution because it's too high. And then that really gives us insight about, well, at what pricing levels do we have particular impacts on the sector? And you may, of course, choose to implement that price anyway, because remembering that a carbon price is meant to drive substitution. The steel sector is particularly interesting because there are applications for steel for which there are no substitutes. So if you're building buildings that are lower than sort of 4 stories, and there are some buildings in Japan and others that have gone higher than that use no steel, but in general, the principle is above 4 stories, you'll need some steel. There are applications like rail that need to run on steel. And so what you have to be cautious of as you charge a price into that market is for those applications for which there is no substitute, you push the price up of that commodity in the market, and you may not cause any change in demand. And so how you use those revenues becomes an interesting conversation. Similar kinds of things in cement, but this gives you a sense of the switching curves for the two products, cement and steel, and this sort of dotted line is a sort of estimated what the carbon price could be over time, but it gives you a sense of where these overlaps and change in demand happen, where you have excess revenue that's not going to cause switching necessarily, and where sectors might be making a loss against the particular carbon price. So getting back to that conversation about EU and the setting of the price, what's really interesting is some work here done by Mark Lewis at BNP Paribas. I think he's moved on since this report was released, but he looks at what is the switching price that would help you drive transition in the EU. In other words, what is the base technology that the EU would need to meet their green plan, and that is effectively hydrogen. And so the carbon price that you need to switch to hydrogen will become the carbon price that's set for the EU, and that is roughly $100 a ton by 2030. Right. Now, if EU implements $100 per ton carbon price by 2030, they will then protect their industries through border tariff adjustments, and by default force countries like South Africa to set an equivalent carbon price, on a purchasing power parity basis. And so we estimate probably about $70 a ton by 2030 in South Africa. When we start to think about the complementary pricing discussion then, so what you'll have is an illustrative carbon price, let's say it's 1,800 Rand a ton, that is too high for power. So if power is paying that tax on per ton on emissions, then that is a price that either has to be passed on to the consumer or borne by the manufacturer in terms of, or the generator in terms of profit loss. Obviously, in the South African case, there is no profit, and so that would be something that has to be either borne by the taxpayer or passed on to the consumer. And so then there are a range of complementary measures that would need to acknowledge that. So if you want to have affordable power, you may have to have some stepped pricing scheme that protects the poor from those price increases, or other measures. And so, but it gives you a sense of, relative to the carbon price, what kinds of complementary measures will be supportive of this. And in the full report, we have some detail around what those complementary measures could be. In the context of the price being lower than what you would need to switch, then you think about different complementary measures. Then you maybe need industry standards that force a transition anyway, because the price on its own is not going to force that transition. Again, though, to get back to this point about granular detail, even within a sector, different prices might drive substitution and switching at different commodities within the sector. So in the steel sector, you might find things like window frames get substituted by more energy efficient competitors, whereas things like reinforced steel bars for skyscrapers don't get substituted at all. So even putting a price on steel in this instance is, again, a simplification, and kind of shows the level of detail that you really need to get to if you're going to talk about pricing effectively. So we thought it was an interesting pilot. There were a couple of things that we thought worked really well, in particular these industry conversations and help trying to understand what the role of carbon pricing really is, getting down to the level of granularity on what it would take to switch, and what the competition risks are, I think was quite new to most people in South Africa. So we think as a pilot it worked really well. It enabled certainly a richer understanding from our side on how carbon pricing works, and the role of pricing and the interaction with complementary policy. A couple of things we still need to do. We need to develop a much better understanding of substitution pricing across the sectors. As I mentioned, getting that competition data was quite challenging. Developing a better understanding of social pricing across sectors is really important. Obviously something we didn't get to, as I mentioned earlier, and something that adds an additional layer of complexity to the conversation. But it also does help with understanding timing of transition. So if we know at what point an additional carbon price will make that product uncompetitive, and therefore you're going to switch to something else, and assuming there's something else to switch to, you know when in time that social impact will happen and can plan for it and implement other measures, complementary policy measures again, to protect those sectors. And then the final sort of thing that we want to do taking this forward is working more closely with government partners and other sectors, and trying to sort of run this process at a slightly higher scale across a range of sectors, and really get to grips with the idea of how carbon pricing impacts competitiveness, as well as making sure that we use the carbon price as an effective tool to decarbonize. So just reminding ourselves that here at COP, our ultimate goal is decarbonization, and in South Africa, decarbonizing by 2050 within the fair share budget. And so the carbon price is one of those major tools to allow us to do that. And we think that studies like this at sort of sector level granularity will help us understand that a lot better. So that is the sort of overview of the study. I'm not sure if there are any questions here in the audience at COP or online. I'm going to pause a little bit and see if there are any questions that come up.
Dear COP delegates, we kindly remind you to wear your face mask over your mouth and nose at all times during your time at the conference, unless you're seated in a room with appropriate distance, while eating or drinking or medically. Thank you for your cooperation.
Okay. There are no questions in the audience, and it doesn't appear that there are any questions online. So we will end this session slightly ahead of schedule. Please do feel free to engage us via email or give us a call if you have any questions or want to discuss this more, or want to perhaps discuss running a similar kind of process with your sector. We'd be very happy to do that. But otherwise, wish you a wonderful rest of the morning, and maybe just to remind you that today is the Just Transition Day at the South African Pavilion, where we'll be focusing on sort of differences between developed and developing country conceptions of a just transition, what we need to do to get a just transition done, what a just transition is. Really range of interesting speakers and interesting topics today, and so welcome you back to that, and please do check the NBI COP schedule and website for those interesting talks for the rest of the day. Hope to see you later, and have a wonderful morning. Thanks. Bye.